Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's video analysis. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this video on YouTube, on Rumble, or on Ganjing Word. The US occupation forces are planning to leave Syria in a matter of weeks, probably a few months. But what is the reason behind this decision? Was this decision anticipated? Was it surprising for you or not? I'm going to explain to you today with facts and from the past events and connecting the dots, what have the American occupation forces done in Syria and why they decided now to leave Syria after the regime change. The US campaign against terrorism in Syria started in 2014 after the CIA and the Pentagon have bankrolled, trained, and equipped multinational takfiris who formed the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria and ISIS. So this responsibility was, of course, on the shoulders of the United States and its allies in the region, who propped up these radical groups from the beginning. However, in 2015, when Assad went to Moscow and he asked Putin for help to crush these terrorist organizations, Putin came with a clear agenda, which is, I'm going to destroy the backbone of these terrorist organizations. I'm not going to allow these organizations to occupy Syria and then probably incite similar insurgencies against Russia within the Russian Federation or on the southern belt or belly of Russia in countries like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., etc., etc. And the Americans saw this as a very dangerous move from Putin, because then if Putin destroys and degrades these terrorist organizations, he will have the upper hand and then he will impose a solution over Syria. So they rushed into Syria and participated in the campaign against ISIS in Al-Raqqa and destroyed basically the entire city and went after the oil fields, which were occupied by ISIS itself. Just for context, ISIS used to sell the Syrian oil in the Turkish black market, and the son of Erdogan was allegedly and reportedly was buying this oil from ISIS and giving them cash. And that's when in 2014, ISIS has become a very strong organization with all these pickup trucks and the equipment and weapons, and they have become independent financially. But this was all thanks to a NATO country, Turkey. Now, the United States didn't want for Russia and the Syrian army to liberate these oil fields, so the US went after ISIS and used some of its proxies, for example, Syrian Democratic Forces, mainly the Kurdish militias, and crushed ISIS in these regions and have taken over the oil fields. Now, somebody will ask why the United States would like to have these oil fields. It's not that much, like it doesn't make so much profits. Yes, but the US has financed its stay in Syria and also its proxy force, the Syrian Democratic Forces, through these revenues of the oil. And the other hand, the United States wanted to block the access of the former Syrian government from having its grip and hand over this oil. Then Assad could sell this oil and make revenues and reconstruct his country. But the plan is to suffocate the Syrian people and destroy the Syrian economy, so the people would be demoralized and rise against Assad, or they don't want to fight any longer against these terrorist groups. So the United States went into Syria on a clear mission, and they have engaged in two businesses, basically. One is they controlled and occupied the oil fields in the eastern bank of the Euphrates, and they occupied the wheat fields. And eventually, this means that the United States can weaponize the carbohydrates and the food basket. So the energy basket and the food basket have become under the grip of the United States. The other reason why the US was there was for Israel. That's why they have established a military base in Al-Tanf border crossing, which is on the borders between Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. And by doing so, they have blocked any free communication and movement and trade routes and probably supply chains for Syria from the neighboring countries or from the region, especially from Iran to Syria. They also helped Israel logistically on the intelligence level. They have installed jamming technologies there, which means they were able to block the satellites of the Syrian army and blinded them. And by doing so, the Israeli fighter jets used to fly over the Jordanian airspace, going all the way over the 10th border crossing and then bombing inside Syria without being detected by the Syrian army radars. Now, You may say, oh, okay, this is subjective, maybe I'm biased. Well, I'm going to show you a video by Dana Stroul. Dana Stroul was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, and she made a very famous, she has a very famous video about this case, basically telling exactly what I told you, but in different terms, because, you know, you have to use some diplomatic terms. You cannot say we are thieves, we are looters, we are there to steal the oil, to steal the wheat fields. No, you use different terminologies, but the meaning is the same. Let's take a look.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report. And then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict.
So the U.S. withdrawal from Syria is not surprising for me at all, because the goal has been achieved. Two of the goals have been achieved. One, the US weaponized the food and the energy basket, impoverished the Syrian people, demoralized them, and they didn't want to fight any longer. So the first goal was achieved, and the regime change happened. The second goal was Israel. After Assad left, Israel has destroyed the entire strategic weaponry, air defenses, airfields, fighter jets, tanks, everything of the Syrian army, ballistic missiles, long-range missiles, etc., etc. And by doing so, it has castrated Syria. So Syria doesn't pose any threat on Israel any longer. And the new regime in Damascus, they are anti-Hezbollah and anti-Iran, which means the Iranian influence is also out of the country. And they have sealed the borders. There is no longer supply chains to Lebanon. All in all, the goal has been achieved. So two of these goals have been achieved. So the United States doesn't have any, let's say, reason to stay there, especially after the agreement between the SDF leader, Mazloum Abdi, and Jolani. This was a few weeks ago. They have signed on a memorandum, and they're going to cooperate together and govern the country together. So the Jolani regime doesn't pose a threat on Israel, doesn't pose a threat against the Kurds. Therefore, Americans have no reason to stay in the country. They were there illegally for a particular reason, and this reason, or the group of reasons, have been achieved. Now, there is another news which is very important. Saudi Arabia is planning to pay the Syrian debt to the World Bank. And of course, this is a goodwill gesture from Saudi Arabia, but I have to give some context, because Saudi Arabia was trying to do the same thing with Assad, and they were trying also to convince the US to lift the sanctions. But they were also telling Assad to reorient its foreign policy approach from the axis of resistance into the moderate Arab camp, which means Syria has to become more in line with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and other, let's say, pro-US countries in the region, and leave the Iran-led axis of resistance. But Assad was reluctant, and he was, let's say, doing some shifts slowly in this case, and the Saudis didn't like that, and they were expecting him to do fast shifts, U-turn in foreign policy approach, which he didn't do. Also, Assad didn't push the Hezbollah and the Palestinians under the bus, because this was the also other demand, that once you reorient yourself on the side of Saudi Arabia and eventually on the side of the United States, they also expect you to normalize ties with Israel. Didn't happen. Now that the regime is gone, Saudi Arabia has an ally in Damascus, somebody who is passive on Israel-Palestine. He doesn't want to fire a bullet. He doesn't want to support the armed struggle of the Palestinians and of the Lebanese. And he says that they will normalize ties with Israel soon, and they're already communicating. And the other day I was talking to an Emirati contact, and this Emirati contact has ties, of course, with the Emirati government. And as you may know, the Emirati government is very much allied with Israel, and they have embedded themselves with the Zionist project in the region. And he told me that he said, you are Sayyid al-Arifin. In Arabic, Sayyid al-Arifin means like, you know better. And he told me it was Israel and Turkey who brought Jolani to power. You know it better than I do. This is what he told me, and I believe in this, and I think that sooner or later Syria will normalize ties with Israel, and you will see the Israeli flag flying over Damascus. So Saudi Arabia also got what it wants from Syria. Syria is now a passive country. It is revolving in the orbit of Saudi Arabia and eventually in the orbit of Israel and the United States in this case. So Saudi Arabia pays some of the millions of Syria's debt to the World Bank, and now the World Bank comes and will offer, of course, loans to Syria. And this is very tricky and controversial because, as you may know, the World Bank is part of the US empire establishment. And what they do basically, they give loans, politicized loans, and they ask for political conditions. And they keep you in this vicious cycle of forever debt. And this is something that happened in Lebanon after the end of this Lebanese civil war. Everybody warned, let's say, the Lebanese back then prime minister and others not to get all these billions of loans from the World Bank, but they did. And now Lebanon is in a forever debt situation forever. Don't quote me on this, but I have read, this was 2-3 years ago, that when every Lebanese is born, they have, I think, between 60 to 80,000 debt to the World Bank. So this is going to be a crazy time for Syria. And if in the future another government comes or a coup happens or patriots come to power again, I don't know, Syria will still be under forever debt. So what they're trying to do is basically an economic assassination of Syria. After castrating it militarily, now they're castrating it economically. Finally, today I have read an article on The Time. And The Time has listed the 100 most influential people of 2025. And one of the figures is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. They call him Ahmad al-Shara. And the author of the biography, basically, of Jolani is Robert Ford. Robert Ford is the former US ambassador to Damascus, to Syria. And at the beginning of the protests against Assad in 2011, he participated in these protests in central city of Hama alongside the protesters, and he encouraged others to join. He was in direct communication and ties with the Syrian opposition, including Syrian opposition figures who used to live in Damascus, and he used to invite them to the embassy to speak with them. So today, I mean, I'm not surprised at all that this is happening. At the end of the day, they are truly doing a lot to polish the reputation of Jolani. However, I think that after writing this piece on Jolani, the former US ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, went to a bar and toasted his deep state friends and colleagues with take beer. I think that's how things proceeded. Anyways, sometimes it's I laugh because it is very it's beyond ridiculous, and sometimes the only thing that comes to mind is just like crying over this dire situation, but the body does and the mind does some crazy tricks, so you start laughing about it. Anyways, I've been your host, Kevork Almassian of Syriana Analysis. Thank you very much, guys, for watching this video. If you like this content, hit the like button, subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are 1,700 subscriptions away from the 100K goal. And I will see you on Friday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. I will be with Professor Dr. Tarek Cheril Amar. There is a lot to talk on the international geopolitics. So if you're looking forward to that, stay tuned. We're going to do it tomorrow. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.